Well, hey there, friends. I'm your host, Penny, and this is Criminally Nerdy. How are all of my lovely lovelies doing? I hope the start of spooky season is making you as warm and fuzzy as it's making me. We got the big skeleton set up outside. If you follow me on socials, you may have seen her. The inside got its spooktacular makeover last weekend, and we took the kiddos to see Beetlejuice. Ugh, it hit all the nostalgia buttons. I have a couple of opinions that I won't share because I don't want to spoil anything if you haven't seen it yet, but holla at your girl if you got some feelings that you need to get off your chest. Speaking of socials, you may have seen my post on Friday the 13th about the giveaway for the limited edition Criminally Nerdy t-shirt. And when I say limited edition, I mean limited. There are like 10 in existence, one owned by yours truly. If you didn't see the post, don't worry, I've got you. It's really easy to enter. Just go wherever you're listening and write a review or drop a 5-star. Screenshot that bad boy and DM it to me on any of my socials or email it to criminallynerdypodcast@gmail.com. That's it. You're entered. Fun fact, you can enter as many times as you want by rating on different apps. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Facebook, Good Pods, Audible, you name it. I will put all entries in my little coffin and draw a name on October 13th, so you've got a full month. I'll post a video of the drawing on Monday, October 14th to let the proud new owner know to be on the lookout. In podcast world, I wanted to say happy 6 months to the show. Criminally Nerdy hit the 6-month mark this past week, so I thought I'd share with you all how far we've come. This show has put out 931 minutes of content. That is just over 15 and a half hours. In the U.S., we've reached 221 cities in 39 states. Worldwide, we've reached 57 cities in 18 different countries. That's a total of 278 cities in 19 countries. The furthest we've traveled is nearly 9,700 miles to the city of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia. Whoever you are in Victoria, I love you. I keep saying that I'm going to stop fangirling and gushing about my listeners, but today's not that day. I'm still here. I'm still doing it. And the reason is, this is all you. All your hard work, spreading the word, telling other true crime nerds where to find the kind of show that would speak to them. Those numbers fucking floored me, I won't even lie. I know that the every other week format has made some, myself included, wary, but just because the episodes aren't coming out as often as I want them to right now, doesn't mean they won't be in the future. I'm working hard to get to a place where I can produce content more often. Until then, let's just keep doing what we do, because guess what? We are just getting started. This episode is airing on September 16th, which is National Working Parents Day, National Tattoo Story Day, and National Choose Your Chocolate Day. So, call into work. If you're juggling work and kiddos, take the whole week off. You fucking earned it. Kick back and relax with the chocolate of your choice and tell someone the meaning behind one of your tattoos. If you don't have one, I'd say you've got a darn good excuse to go get one, and what a story that will be. It's also National Collect Rocks Day, so if your boss has a problem with you missing another mundane Monday, tell them to go get some fresh air and collect rocks. Today, we will be discussing the disappearance of 3 women in the small town of Woonsocket, Rhode Island. When one of the women, who was already involved in an ongoing case where the suspect was already behind bars, vanished into thin air, the investigation was turned on its head. An anonymous tip led detectives to an unlikely source that helped them untangle the web of coincidences that ultimately ended a serial killer's bloody reign of terror. This is the case of Jeffrey Mailhot, also known as the Rhode Island Ripper. Please be warned, this episode will have discussions about drug abuse as well as assault and battery, sexual assault, murder, and mutilation. Before we jump into this case, I want to address that we will also be discussing sex work. Something I don't mention often enough is that sex work is something that we as a society tend to dance around. The statistics of those in the sex work industry show that while some are in by choice, of those who do not set out to enter this particular line of work, 73% entered the sex trade for drugs, while another 36% entered in order to afford basic necessities like food, housing, or to care for family members. Sex work is a high-risk industry with staggering numbers which are vastly underreported, reporting physical and/or sexual violence. As we are sadly all too aware, there is also a much greater risk of that violence escalating to homicide. No matter what the reason is for someone entering this line of work, which, to be clear, no one needs to justify, their choice is their choice. People in the sex work industry should be treated with nothing less than dignity and respect. They have the same rights as everyone else. Their no means as much as anyone else's no, and their life is just as valuable as anyone else's life. Some of my sources for this case were the Boston Globe, SueColetta.com, the New England True Crime Podcast, the State vs. Scanlon transcripts, and the book Ripper by Linda Rosenkrantz and Captain Edward Lee, Jr. On March 2, 2003, a local sex worker, Janet Smith, whose name has been changed to protect her privacy, was leaving Buddy's bar in Woonsocket when she was approached by a man in an SUV who asked if she wanted to party. Janet had been struggling with drug addiction and was no stranger to the sex work industry, so she knew that this meant that he intended to exchange money for sex. She had admittedly turned to this line of work to help feed her habit. The two agreed on services in exchange for $40, so she got into his vehicle and the driver stopped at the ATM to get cash. As he was getting the money, Janet started to feel strange about the situation. It may have been because she had been drinking heavily and taking cocaine, so she was tired. It may have been because she got a strange vibe from the guy. Whatever the case, when he got back into the SUV, she said that she had decided that she didn't want to party after all and asked that he take her home. He seemed fine with this, at first. He began driving, but when Janet pointed out that he had missed the turn he needed to take, he became enraged. Warning, this next bit is going to be graphic. He started stabbing her in the head, face, and neck with a screwdriver while calling her every name but her own. He finally brought the vehicle to a stop at an abandoned mill while continuing to push the screwdriver into her now open and bleeding wounds. He demanded that she give him all of her money and forced her to strip. She complied, handing over what little cash she had and removing everything but her socks. He then sexually assaulted her while continuing to threaten and insult her. To Janet's relief, he seemed to tire because he reached across her, opened the passenger door, and literally kicked her out into the cold, snowy night wearing nothing but her socks. Sadly, her relief was only temporary. The driver proceeded to get out of the truck and follow her. He forced her to the ground where he sexually assaulted her again. Afterwards, he drug her over to his truck and forced her to her knees, where he made her perform oral sex. During all of this, he was punching her, ripping hair from her head, berating her, and continuing to stab her with the screwdriver. In his last act of heartlessness, this piece of shit yanked her up by the arm so violently that he dislocated her shoulder and threw her off to the side, threatening to kill her if she told police what had happened. He then sped off, leaving the badly beaten, bleeding, naked woman in the cold New England night. Janet found the strength to crawl to the middle of a nearby road where someone driving by happened to see her and called for help. She was treated for her injuries at the Landmark Medical Center, and though she was hesitant, gave police as much detail as she could recall about the vehicle and the stocky, blonde, white man in his 30s with tattoos on his arms. Police canvassed for witnesses to no avail. Janet was shown photos of possible assailants, but none matched the man who had brutally attacked her. It wouldn't be until later that the trauma of the attack had worn off a bit that Janet would be able to remember a crucial detail that would help bring down her assailant. Unfortunately, that memory wouldn't resurface until after he struck again. On April 11th, 2003, 42-year-old Christine Dumont was walking in the same area as Janet had been weeks prior when a man pulled up and asked if she wanted to party. Christine was a sex worker and was also struggling with drug addiction, so she too knew exactly what this meant. The two agreed to go to a local tavern to grab a drink first, but when the man drove past it, Christine yelled for him to stop the car. Christine was the fearless sort, so when he didn't stop the car, she opened the door and jumped out at her first opportunity. Sadly, this asshole wasn't the type to give up easily, so he stopped the car, walked up to her, and threw her in his trunk. She wasn't going to go quietly into the night, though, so as he drove, she found a tire iron in his trunk and began pounding on the vehicle. By the time he had parked the car, he was in a full-blown rage. He yanked her out and threw her to the ground, screaming that she was, again, everything but her name. He began beating her in the head. I've read that it was the tire iron from the vehicle, and I've also read that it was a metal pipe. Either way, it seemed to be the same scenario as with Janet, a weapon of opportunity, something he either had with him or found close by. He bashed her in the head repeatedly. Christine fought back as hard as she could, but he overpowered her. By the end of the attack, she was too weak to even hold her hands over her face to defend herself. She was convinced that he had every intention of killing her, so she stopped fighting and laid back on the ground, hoping that he would assume she was dead and leave. It worked because after he had finished viciously beating her, he fled the scene, leaving her in the parking lot of an abandoned mill in the middle of the night. Somehow, Christine was able to make her way to a payphone where she called for help. Police arrived and she was reluctant at first because, as we hear all too often, though they are the victims, the nature of their work and the bias of law enforcement can be a huge hurdle to overcome. Thankfully, that was not the case here. Patrolman Kevin Greenow took Christine very seriously. After taking her statement and seeing that she got taken safely off for medical treatment, he began canvassing for evidence or witnesses. Detective Gerald Durand was assigned to the case and assisted in gathering evidence as well. It took no time for them both to realize that aside from the fact that Christine had not been sexually assaulted, her attack bore an almost identical resemblance to what had happened to Janet Smith just 1 month ago. They were certain it was the same man when Christine gave a description of her assailant. A white man in his 30s, kind of muscular, blonde hair, and tattoos on his arms. But they hit the exact same dead end that they hit with Janet. No eyewitnesses, and when they showed Christine photos of possible suspects, she said with clarity that none of them were her attacker. Investigators decided that now might be a good time to go back and speak with Janet, see if there was anything else she could recall. Any small detail that could be helpful in identifying the man who was out terrorizing the women of Woonsocket. And it paid off. The trauma of her attack had worn off a little, and she was able to remember something. She was able to remember that he had stopped at that ATM. And away we go. Investigators were able to find footage from the night of Janet's attack, and there he is. The early 30s, blonde, stocky, tattooed man, on camera, making a withdrawal from his bank account. Criminals is dumb. And just like that, they've got a name. Timothy Scanlon, who is actually only 24 years old. They look at his record, and young Timmy has been a busy boy. He's got charges for larceny, reckless driving, possession of a concealed weapon, and possession of a stolen vehicle. They show his photo to both Janet and Christine, and with no hesitation, both women positively identify him as their attacker. Timothy was arrested on April 15, 2003 for 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 counts of felony assault. Shockingly, he denied the accusations. He stated that he took part in consensual activities with Janet and gave Christine a ride, but that was all. Whatever happened to the women must have happened after they parted ways. Super convenient, Timmy. He even goes so far as to say that he had recently ripped off a couple of local drug dealers due to his own struggles with addiction, and that in retaliation, they had put the women up to fabricating their stories to get back at him. Someone sure thinks highly of himself. And I've heard of method acting, but stabbing yourself with a screwdriver and hitting yourself in the head with a metal pipe? Damn, that's above and beyond if I've ever heard it. Just kidding. Go fuck yourself, Tim. Aside from the women's positive identifications, remember, they both fought back, and they were both examined. So if there were any doubt to be had, DNA was going to shut that shit down. Timothy Scanlon pled not guilty, but the judge denied his bail, and he was remanded to police custody until his trial. Janet had identified him, made her report, and submitted to the physical examination for them to gather evidence, but she wasn't sure if she could withstand testifying. Christine, on the other hand, readily agreed. She was described as quite the spitfire, and she was determined that Timothy was going to face justice for what he had done. There was another woman that I assume they were looking at for Timothy as well. 33-year-old Audrey Harris had been missing since February 9th, 2003, when her mother reported her disappearance after she hadn't been heard from for a few days. She fit Timothy's victim profile. Audrey was a sex worker who had been struggling with drug addiction, and she frequented the same areas as Janet and Christine. But here's the problem. Timothy had made a couple of offhanded statements when he was first arrested, but he quickly lawyered up, so even if they thought he had been involved with her disappearance, I haven't been able to find if they were ever able to question him about it. I know what you're thinking right about now. Penny, I saw the name of the episode, and it wasn't Timothy Scanlon. You're right. He's not the bad guy. He's a bad guy. A real bad guy. And we're gonna drag his ass, don't you worry. Well, someone is. Sadly, this case just so happens to intersect 2 awful human beings at the same time, and right now is where their stories crash into one another. I really fucking hate this. It's like I get 2 bad guys for the price of 1 when I'll pay you double for fucking 0. A little over a year after Timothy's arrest, Christine Dumont disappeared. The last time anyone had seen or heard from her was on Friday, April 23, 2004. Not only had Christine failed to pick up her disability check, but she hadn't spoken with either of her sons for 2 days. Christine had her fair share of issues. I won't sugarcoat that for you. But she called her sons every night. You could set your watch to it. Her sister Madeline knew this was cause for serious concern, so she immediately went to the police station to report her sister missing. It was a Sunday, and the officer on duty basically scoffed at her and told her she'd have to come back Monday morning, claiming that they had just seen Christine since she was a frequent flyer. I do not know how Madeline resisted the urge to climb across that counter, but she did. She returned first thing Monday morning, but the treatment she received wasn't any better. She had the missing persons form basically tossed at her, showing the utmost disregard. Madeline said she was heartbroken by their callous response, but she still completed the report and turned it in. Afterwards, she tried going to the media for help, but apparently a missing sex worker struggling with drug addiction wasn't newsworthy enough for them, because that's how they classified Christine, not as a human being. Regardless of how the officer taking the report seemed to not care, and the media initially all but shrugged her off, the man assigned to her case, Sergeant Steve Nowak, didn't. His first thought, obviously, was that Timothy Scanlon had something to do with her disappearance. With Janet still on the fence about testifying, Christine was their star witness. Her testimony about his vicious attack would be the nail in the coffin for the lengthy jail sentence he had rightfully earned. But not only was he in custody and incapable of doing anything himself, they couldn't find any outside connection. Timothy is a sack of shit, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't look like he's got anything to do with Christine's disappearance. Sergeant Nowak checks all hospitals and jails in the area to make sure she hasn't been admitted or arrested for something, but no Christine. None of her acquaintances have seen or heard from her, nor do they have any idea where she would have gone if not with family. While in the midst of his investigation into Christine's disappearance, he got hit with yet another missing woman. On July 7, 2004, James Nelson reported to the Woonsocket Police Department that his girlfriend, 24-year-old Stacy Goulet, who was 3 months pregnant, had gone missing sometime in the late evening of July 3rd or early morning of July 4th. When Sergeant Nowak asked why it had taken him so long to report her missing, James explained that he had been looking for her himself on the first day, but he was hesitant because Stacy was a sex worker. He and Stacy were both battling drug addiction, and he was concerned about how it would look and if they would be taken seriously. James said the two were walking around that day with plans to go to the fireworks show at City Park. They ran into Stacy's father, Ray, who at one point mentioned something to Stacy about how she needed to stay focused on staying on the straight and narrow so that she could get her children back. Sometime after Ray drove off, Stacy told James that she was going to look for a client. To his recollection, he only took his eyes off of her for a few moments and she was just gone. He assumed that she had found someone looking for her services and that she would be back in a little while. James and Stacy had a system in place where they would meet at a specific spot in the park when she was done with a client, but she never showed. He was immediately concerned because Stacy had told him that on a couple of occasions, clients had kept her against her will for longer than they had agreed. James stayed within the vicinity of the park all night and was even stopped by police for being there after hours. He asked them if Stacy had been arrested, thinking maybe she had been busted, but they told him he would have to check with the station. They then advised that he would need to leave the park because it was closed, so he went home. To the detectives, James looked pretty damn suspicious at first. Very shifty, very nervous. Plus, he's the boyfriend, and was the last person to see her. But they were quickly able to verify that he was seen with her by her father, and that he was in the park that night looking for her by Woonsocket patrol officers. Sergeant, and eventually Captain, Edward Lee Jr. was called in to work the case with Sergeant Nowak. Their superior advised that they would be working on the case of 3 missing women, Audrey Harris, Christine Dumont, and Stacy Goulet. All 3 were sex workers, struggling with drug addiction, and vanished from the same general area with no eyewitnesses. Boy, did they have their work cut out for them. That's one unfortunate problem for law enforcement and a very real danger for women in the sex work industry. They get into vehicles willingly and discreetly, so witnesses are rare because no one is screaming, no one is fighting, no one is making a scene. This makes them the perfect target for predators with sinister motives. Thankfully, they weren't in denial like other law enforcement agents we've encountered in the past. In fact, from the beginning, they went with the chief of police to the mayor's office and explained that they believed the disappearances were all connected and that they needed to step it up fast. The mayor agreed, but wanted to keep things quiet until they had proof. They didn't want to go causing the town to unnecessarily spiral into a panic. If fast is what they want, fast is what they got. These guys must have been manifesting masters, because on July 11th, just 4 days after Stacy was reported missing, police received an anonymous tip that they should go and speak with a woman named Jocelyn Martell about an attack that she had survived. 27-year-old Jocelyn didn't take long to find. Due to a recent parole violation, she was serving a 10-month sentence at the Rhode Island Adult Correctional Institution. The next day, On July 12th, they went to speak with her, and boy did she have a story to tell. She told the investigators that sometime in early June of 2004, an SUV pulled up to her around 1:30 in the morning. The man driving was well-dressed and pretty decent-looking. He was in his mid to late 30s, around 5'5" or 5'6", had brown hair, and was in good shape. They came to an arrangement and she agreed to go back to his apartment, which she recalled was in a lime green house with dark green shutters on Cato Street. She said that when they walked in, she was struck by how clean it was. It was clear that he paid great attention to detail by the way things were organized by height or color. He even had a vase on the kitchen table with plastic flowers. It really stood out compared to the stereotypical messy bachelor pad. Jocelyn asked if he wanted to go to the bedroom, but he said he'd rather stay in the living room. As soon as she turned her back to him, he walked up behind her, grabbed her around the throat with his arms, and started choking her. As his grip tightened, she realized immediately that this was no joke. This was not his kink. This man was going to kill her. Her fight or flight kicked in and bad bitch came out. She smashed the back of her head into his so hard that he lost his grip. When she broke free, she jabbed her thumb into his eye and bolted out the door. O-fucking-K, Jocelyn. She said she didn't report the incident because of the same reason many women in her line of work don't report violent attacks. She was afraid that she would be on the receiving end of the punishment instead of her attacker. She did, however, tell others about the encounter and warned women in the area to steer clear of any man matching his description. Investigators knew they needed to look into this. Jocelyn was barely through the door when this man attacked and likely intended to kill her. That suggested someone who was very confident, very violent, or both. Either way, they needed to find him. Back at the police station, investigators checked for records of similar assaults, and I'm telling you, manifesting masters, they found exactly what they were looking for. The report was filed by a woman named T. Morris, who stated that on February 15, 2004, she escaped from a man's apartment on Cato Street after he had attempted to choke and kill her. They went to interview her, and the details of her story were haunting in their similarity to Jocelyn's. She had been out celebrating her birthday when a man who she described as an everyday man approached her and offered to buy her a drink. She said he was clean-cut and friendly, so she accepted. After chatting for a bit, he offered her money in exchange for her services. She agreed, and the two went back to his apartment, which wasn't far from the bar they were at. She recalled that his apartment was inside of a green house on Cato Street. Once inside, she remembered telling him how nice it was. She said it was small, but very neat and clean. So much so that she actually felt flattered that he had approached her because he seemed like the kind of man who would attract a lot of women. He offered her a beer and after handing it to her, asked her to grab a napkin. When she turned around to grab it, he pounced. He put her in a chokehold and began tightening his grip. She dropped her beer and tried fighting back. She kicked and scratched, but she couldn't make any noise. Finally, she got a hold of his shirt and pushed him back over the stove to the point where he was bent backwards over it. His grip finally loosened enough for her to speak, but he didn't let her go. He drug her back to his bedroom and threw her towards the bed. She was able to get to the window where she pounded and screamed for help, but no one heard her. He got to her again and started to choke her, but she begged him to let her leave. She offered him all of the money in her wallet and cried, saying, "Please, please let me go. I have a baby. Please, I just want to see my daughter." T said she had known that he was going to kill her, but something came over him, and he just let her go. He told her to go and that he didn't want to see her around anymore, and that if he did, he would kill her. She didn't waste any time. she ran out of his apartment, leaving everything she'd brought, including her shoes. She remembers this clearly because she slipped on the ice as she ran down the road barefoot. She flagged down a passerby and asked them to take her to the police station. At the station, she gave her statement, and an officer agreed to drive her back to the apartment. She went, but when they arrived and she saw his vehicle in the driveway, she was too scared to go up to the door. The officer couldn't just go bust in the door, so they filed the report and went on their way. With all of this information, investigators knew that they had a solid lead. To cover their bases, they had both Jocelyn and Teese look at the photos to identify their attacker. They both identified the same man, the man who lived in the apartment they had both narrowly escaped with their lives. A local man with no criminal history, not even so much as a parking ticket. 33-year-old Jeffrey Mailhot. Jeffrey Mailhot was born on November 9, 1970. He was raised in Woonsocket, growing up in a quiet subdivision. His parents divorced when he was 9. He was fairly quiet and kept to himself throughout school, graduating Woonsocket High School in 1989. Tragically, the year before he walked across the stage, his mother died of lung cancer when he was only 17 years old. 5 years later, his father also passed away from lung cancer when Jeffrey was 22. He lived with his stepmother in Lincoln, Rhode Island for a short time before returning to Woonsocket. He got a job at a local paper mill and rented the downtown apartment on the first floor of a nice house on Cato Street. Around this time, he started to break out of his shell a bit. He began bodybuilding, went to karaoke nights at local bars, and even treated himself to a $17,000 Harley-Davidson Fat Boy motorcycle. He was considered to be polite and considerate by all who knew him, but the emotional issues he carried were still there, no matter how deep he buried them. He had dated a woman for a while. She said he was a great guy. He was the perfect gentleman to her and her family. When it came to sex, she actually enjoyed the rougher aspects, but it never really seemed to interest him. He preferred things to be more sensual. He would occasionally choke her during foreplay, but it was always at her request and never to the point that she felt uncomfortable. Their relationship eventually fell apart when things started to get serious. She told him that she felt like she could fall in love with him, but he told her that he would never be able to love anyone and that he would always be alone. Though they had broken up, she figured they would always be friends because he was such a nice man. I'm not going to say it was all an act because I'm sure there were parts of Jeffrey that were genuine when he was with his friends and loved ones, but his truest self shone through when he was alone with a helpless woman. Aside from the statements from Jocelyn and Teese, detectives interviewed 3 other women who had reported being attacked and choked by a man who lived on Cato Street. One of the women refused to file a report, and the other 2 were unable to identify Jeffrey from a photo lineup. Still, the information they had already gathered was enough for a judge to grant a search warrant. On July 16, 2004, Jeffrey returned home from work and was greeted by investigators, including Sergeant Lee, Sergeant Nowak, and Detective Durand, who had been working on the cases connected to Christine since her encounter with Timothy Scanlon. Jeffrey was arrested for assault with a dangerous weapon, his hands, and taken for interrogation by Lee and Nowak while Durand and the forensic team began looking for items that would support the claims of Jocelyn and Teese's attacks. Though Sergeant Lee and Sergeant Nowak were seasoned investigators, neither of them were prepared for what was going to happen in the small interrogation room back at the station. Jeffrey agreed to be questioned and waived his right to have an attorney present. At first, he denied ever even picking up a sex worker. Gradually, he admitted that he had picked up a few over the past couple of years, and that he had gotten rough with them on occasion. They questioned him for hours, but things took a rather sudden shift when detectives laid out photos of Audrey Harris, Christine Dumont, and Stacy Goulet on the table. Sergeant Lee said it looked like someone had walked over Jeffrey's grave. He says to them, "Oh, I know. You think I killed those girls, but I didn't." Lee and Nowak were careful because they knew they had him. Right there, they had him. They asked, "What do you mean killed? We never mentioned anything about killed." Over the next 4 hours, Jeffrey Mailhot told them every horrific detail of all 3 women's final moments. He was driving home from a strip club when he picked up Audrey Harris just after midnight in early February of 2003. The two agreed to $30 and she went back to his apartment with him. When they got to his bedroom, she asked for payment before they got started, and something inside of Jeffrey snapped. He went into an uncontrollable rage and put her into a chokehold and wrestled her to the ground. She tried to fight him. She tried so hard. But in the end, he overpowered her. After she had stopped moving, he stood up and looked down only to realize that she was still barely alive. He grabbed a pillow and pushed it against her face until he was sure she was dead. He drug her body into the bathroom, placed her in the bathtub, and put all of her clothes and belongings into a trash bag. At that point, he went to his bedroom and just passed out. Seriously? You just murdered someone and then went to bed? Okay. He woke up the next morning and said he had no memory of the night before until he walked into his bathroom. When he saw her lifeless body, everything came rushing back. "I'm sorry, but what?" He did admit that he had been drinking, but I cannot fathom any level of intoxication that would lead you to wake up and not remember killing another human being. Realizing that this was a rather pressing matter, he called in to work sick that day. Not using one of my excuses. And I will agree, he's pretty fucking sick. But what happens next is a whole different level. He went to Walmart and purchased a roll of carpet and heavy-duty plastic wrap. He put her body in the carpet and wrapped it, placed it in his SUV, and drove around town looking for a place to dispose of her. But he couldn't. He was too scared that someone would see him. So he went back home, took her body back inside, and laid her on the floor while he tried to come up with another plan. Then, inspiration came from an unexpected source. The Sopranos. He remembered the episode he had seen months prior where Tony Soprano killed Ralph Cifaretto and how he disposed of the body. Warning, this part will be graphic. Drawing on this, he placed Audrey's body back in the bathtub, went to the basement, and grabbed his handsaw. He then proceeded to dismember her, removing her head, hands, feet, arms, legs, and cutting her torso in 2. Once he had her in small enough pieces, he placed the pieces of her body into trash bags, wrapped those bags in plastic, and put them inside of a second trash bag. He then drove around Woonsocket, disposing of her belongings, and his saw in different dumpsters. I'm sorry, but yes, unfortunately you heard me correctly. He dismembered her and tossed her away like she was garbage. He did the same with Christine Dumont and Stacy Goulet. He picked each woman up, took them back to his apartment, and almost immediately placed them in a chokehold and strangled them to death. He then dismembered them in his bathtub and discarded their remains in different dumpsters around town. He admitted that there had been other women who he had choked, but that he had let go. He didn't seem to have a rhyme or reason. Some were because they fought, some were because he changed his mind. Some were because they didn't die, they only passed out, and when they woke up, his rage had passed. Investigators were obviously dumbfounded. This man just confessed to being a serial killer, viciously murdering, dismembering, and discarding women. But throughout his confession, they found that though he fit the definition of serial killer by his victim count, he didn't fit the typical profile. The uncontrollable rage that he described would come over him didn't begin until adulthood. There had been no signs of it when he was a child. He said that he believed alcohol may have been a trigger, but it certainly wasn't the cause. He didn't get any sexual gratification from killing the women, nor did he keep any souvenirs or trophies. Had the killings not been as spread out, he may have more so fit the definition of a spree killer. He did admit, and investigators believe, that had he not been caught, he would have continued killing. However you want to look at it, this man was a cold-blooded monster. And quick little side journey. If you haven't watched The Sopranos, honey, clear your schedule. Binge it. Binge it now. If you have, as a refresher, Tony Soprano rid the world of Ralphie Cifaretto because he killed an innocent sex worker, and that didn't sit right with Tony. So the fact that this fuckface drew his inspiration from that particular scene is maddening. He should have to sit down and explain it himself to Tony, man to man, and face the consequences. But this is real life, so his consequences were going to come from a court of law. A massive effort was underway to ensure Jeffrey's conviction, from the forensic team at his home to the detectives who combed through hours of footage to find evidence of him purchasing the handsaw he used from Lowe's, to the 30 officers who spent 10 days raking through a landfill searching for the women's remains. Every available law enforcement officer threw themselves into making sure that this case was airtight. In their efforts, they were able to locate the partial remains of Stacy Goulet, but Audrey Harris and Christine Dumont were never found. The community was in shock that the polite, well-dressed, handsome young man living beside them had been murdering women right under their noses. Those who interacted with him, from local shop owners to social acquaintances, were in utter disbelief. At his arraignment in January of 2005, Jeffrey pled not guilty to the charges. Law enforcement, the community, and the families were prepared for a trial, but the trial never came. Jeffrey had a change of heart, telling Sergeant Lee that he wanted to help bring closure to the families and confessing that he wanted to die. Sergeant Lee explained to him that as much as he'd like to oblige the request, Rhode Island didn't have the death penalty, but he could surely do a lot in the closure department. So on February 15th, 2006, he pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of assault with the intent to commit murder, and 1 count of felony assault. The families were spared a trial, but they were given the opportunity to address Jeffrey and the pain he had brought by taking their loved ones. He was admonished for seeking them out and seeing them as less because of their struggles. Yes, these women were all battling addiction. I won't paint them as perfect, because who is? They were complex, and they were doing the best they could. Isn't that what we're all doing, every single day? No matter what your circumstances look like, when you lay your head down at night, I'm willing to bet that you did the best you could possibly do that day, no matter what your best looked like. That's what these women were doing. Their best. They were mothers. They were daughters. They were sisters. They were aunts. They were beautiful. They were kind. They were caring. They were fighting. They were strong. They were loved. And they are deeply missed because someone took what didn't fucking belong to him. Their lives. Jeffrey Mailhot was given 2 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 10 years. He could be eligible for parole in 2047 at the age of 77, but something tells me there are some pretty fierce people in Woonsocket who will be present at the parole hearings to make sure he never steps foot outside of prison again. Jocelyn Martell was praised as a hero for being the one to help put the pieces together to bring Jeffrey down. She didn't accept this moniker, though. She just wanted to protect the other women. She said, quote, "The reason I went out of my way is because if the shoe was on the other foot, I'm sure the girls would have done the same for me. Even though we all had drug problems, we all had families and moms that loved us. I felt I had an obligation because I got away, like I had a reason. God did what he did for a reason." Jocelyn finished her sentence and was released, but I am sad to say that she unfortunately passed away due to complications from pneumonia in March of 2011 at the age of 32. She may not have thought of herself as a hero, but I sure as hell do. And so is Tese Morris, and so is Janet Smith. Wherever they are, I hope they have found all of the peace and happiness they deserve. Christine Dumont's family placed a pink stone memorial next to a tree at River Island Park that reads, quote, "With love and fond memories, we dedicate this tree to Christine Dumont, Audrey Harris, and Stacy Goulet." The tree was unfortunately cut down, but a new one was planted in honor of the memory of the victims in 2015. Now don't go thinking I forgot about that dick-faced Timothy Scanlon. In November of 2005, he was found guilty on 6 counts in regards to the attack on Janet Smith. He could not be tried for the attack on Christine Dumont because of Jeffrey Mailhot's actions. This did not, however, stop the court from seeing the severity of his crimes and sentencing him to 50 years in prison. He appealed, asking for leniency. In response, the state recounted the horrific details of the attack and that since he showed no compassion when he had beaten, raped, stabbed, and robbed his victim, he did not deserve compassion or leniency from the court. The court clearly agreed because the justice said, quote, "If ever a defendant deserved exceptional punishment, this defendant did. Mr. Scanlon, you are one of the most despicable individuals who has ever appeared in my courtroom in the last 25 years. If ever a sentence was commiserate with the egregious criminal misconduct that a defendant created, you are the prime example. Not by the most elastic stretch of the most fertile imagination is there one iota of mitigating factors that would persuade any casual observer, much less someone who watched this trial and heard and saw what you did to this woman, to conclude that you are somehow entitled to a scintilla of clemency. I'm not going to expand the pages of this record unnecessarily. The trial transcript speaks for itself. The motion is denied." I mean, damn. Formal request to be best friends with the justice that ripped that man's soul from his body. Please. I don't even need to drag him. The court did it for me. Holy shit, I need a sip of water. That was incredible. Jeffrey Mailhot and Timothy Scanlon remain incarcerated, and it is my sincere hope that they are both having the worst possible day every single fucking day. And that, my friends, is the case of Jeffrey Mailhot, also known as the Rhode Island Ripper, with a side of Timothy Scanlon. That's all I've got for you today, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. If you would like to make a donation to the podcast, there will be a support the show link in the show notes, or you can go to buymeacoffee.com/criminallynerdypodcast. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, now Threads, and TikTok at Criminally Nerdy Podcast, Twitter, X, whatever, at Crime Nerd Pod, or shoot me an email anytime at criminallynerdypodcast@gmail.com. Till next time, keep it nerdy. Never trust the living! Why can't I say that? Bleh. Man. Motherfucker. It's the other way around, that I should be asking him for something he can't refuse. Nope. Nope, nope, nope. That sounded dumb. That was bad. Well, fuck. No. Shit. Hold on, there's a plane going by. Live next to the airport, they said. Damn it. Fuck that guy. I swear, this afterlife is so random. Go ahead. Make my millennium. Oops. Okay. A little gasoline, a blowtorch. No problem. Fuckity fuck shit. Why do I always find myself living next to or working next to an airport? Why are there so many fucking airports in Indiana? Stacy's mom has got it going on. No, that sucked. That sounded bad. Shit. Girlining? Girlining. That's a word. Look it up. Damn it. Motherfucker, damn it. Pode? I know just as much about the supernatural as I do about interior design.